It's been a little while since I've done a calling out fake quotes video in which I identify and then comment a little bit about the provenance and the reasons why these fake quotes aren't likely to be by the people that they're attributed to. So I decided this time around to look at those attributed wrongly, falsely, to St. Thomas Aquinas, a major Catholic philosopher, theologian, great thinker, and there's a lot of them out there. So we're just looking at a selection. I'm going to give you 10 definitely fake quotes, and we'll have a bonus as well, which is not just a fake quote, but an entire fake poem wrongly attributed to Thomas Aquinas. I do want to say that these tend to circulate not just in the usual places on the internet, that is all of those quote sites that are just rife with fake quotes that nobody has bothered to actually check on and properly source. There's also a lot of these floating around, we could say, in the Catholic portion of the internet, and even in some anti-Catholic parts of the internet where they're getting attributed to Thomas Aquinas as well. So that said, let's jump in and start looking at them. So our very first quote is, "The things we love tell us what we are." And this is actually coming from a couple different places. So you can find it in the writings of a different Thomas, a much more contemporary one, Thomas Merton, his thoughts in Solitude, but it also shows up in Peter Kreeft, who's a Thomistic philosopher, his Socrates meets Kant, which cites the Summa Theologia, and it's kind of a paraphrase of parts of Thomas's works, but it's not what Thomas actually says. So here's the portion of the Summa Theologia that might be relevant. Thomas says, "A person is reckoned to be good or bad according to the pleasure of the human will, since that person is good and virtuous who takes pleasure in the works of virtue, and that person is evil who takes pleasure in evil works." So not entirely off base, but Thomas doesn't say quite this, and it would be a little weird for him to phrase things like that. It's a very modern way of talking. The second one is a fake quote that we've seen attributed to other people. I've talked about this in previous videos. "I fear the man of a single book," or the variant, "beware the man of one book." So this is a phrase that does get attributed to Thomas Aquinas, typically in the Latin. Oftentimes you get it in the Latin and in the English. "Homo unius libri timeo," I fear the man of a single book. And it's an Anglican bishop, Jeremy Taylor, who attributed that to Thomas Aquinas. It isn't actually said by Thomas anywhere in his works. And then once it got attributed to him, all sorts of other people picked up on that, and it's just been repeated really for about 3.5 centuries, I would say. So, this is not a real quote by Aquinas. It would be weird for him to say something like that. So there we go. It's not a real quote. This third one is a favorite on certain kind of Catholic websites. "God has entrusted the keys and treasures of the kingdom of heaven to Mary." So if you're really, really, really into Mary, the Mother of God, then you might like that. And it's being attributed to various works of Thomas Aquinas. For example, the exposition on the Salve Regina and and he didn't actually write such a work. So that is a bit of a problem. And this is one where we're really fortunate in that Fawkes Citations tracked it down for us. And who's it from? Well, it's a later author, not Thomas Aquinas, but Saint Alphonsus Liguori in The Glories of Mary, and it is attributed to Louis de Blois or Blosius. So definitely not a Thomas Aquinas quote. You know, this Marian devotion becomes stronger and stronger in the times after Aquinas, so it kind of makes sense that it's not by him. We get the first of our, let's call these on the one hand, on the other hand quotes with this one. To one who has faith, no explanation is necessary. To one without faith, no explanation is possible. Now, there are some things that Thomas says that make a contrast between people who have faith and people who don't have faith, and whether they have knowledge or not. But explanation, that's not really a term that Thomas is using. He says demonstration more often. But would Thomas actually say this? To a person who has faith, no explanation is necessary? I mean, nobody who's ever read the very beginning of the Summa Theologia would ever buy that Thomas Aquinas said that. And to say as a follow-up, to one without faith, no explanation is possible, well, that's kind of crazy talk. You know, Thomas thinks that you can actually demonstrate a whole bunch of things to people who don't have faith. And again, you know, not just the Summa Theologia, but all sorts of works, Thomas engages in that very activity. So this is just kind of goofy stuff that there's no way Thomas would have ever have said this. Now here is the second one along these lines. Obedience unites us so closely to God that in a way transforms us into Him so that we have no other will but His. If obedience is lacking, even prayer cannot be pleasing to God. So we got a sort of 1-2 punch here. Tells us about obedience, tells us about what happens if you don't have obedience. And now to be sure, Thomas does in fact think that obedience to God can, in fact, bring us close to Him. It's not just obedience, though. It's actually charity that is really central. So obedience is kind of a different virtue, we could say. And, you know, it is a way that we can perfect ourselves. So this is coming from the perfection of the spiritual life. However, the idea that lacking obedience, prayer cannot be pleasing to God, you're not going to actually find that in Aquinas, and you're really not going to find that in very many medieval thinkers, I would say, in general. So, you know, this is kind of an extra add-on. Again, sort of like, at least in the first part, stuff that Thomas actually does say, but this is not from Thomas Aquinas himself. This next one is a favorite of many, many people. Sorrow can be alleviated by a good sleep, a bath, and a glass of wine. Can't you just see yourself in the tub with suds and, you know, having that glass of wine that's sitting on the edge, taking a nice bath, maybe reading a book, maybe listening to some music, getting out, and then going to sleep. And that's how you get over your sorrow, instead of sitting in front of the refrigerator, as we see in sitcoms and movies, shoveling ice cream into your face. Now, Thomas Aquinas does in fact think that sleep and baths are a remedy for sorrow. He does actually say that in the Prima Secundae, question 38. He also thinks that all sorts of other pleasures can be remedies for sorrow, and other things too, like weeping, sympathy of friends, contemplation of the truth. The one thing that he doesn't say is actually an alleviation or remedy for sorrow is a glass of wine. He doesn't say that at all. And he's also not saying this in a sort of, you know, condensed form. He tells us about a number of different remedies for sorrow. So this one is kind of fake, kind of not. Here is another funny one that's been circulating around. Prostitution in towns is like the sewer in a palace. Take away the sewers and the palace becomes an impure and stinking place. And this is used as a sort of justification for, venial sins should be allowed so that we don't have greater sins getting heaped up. And it is, in fact, a paraphrase of a passage, which itself is a paraphrase of Augustine by somebody else called Ptolemy of Lucca, who is finishing up an unfinished work by Aquinas, which is saying that, yes, we should do these sorts of things. And the passage reads, Augustine says that a whore acts in the world as a bilge in a ship or the sewer in a palace. So there we see the sewer. Remove the sewer, you'll fill the palace with a stench. And so this is on the government of rulers, which was an unfinished work by Thomas Aquinas. And so this is the continuation, the continuatio of this, written by Ptolemy. So definitely not by Aquinas, but by a different author, but it's understandable how it could get attributed to Aquinas. Here's another fake quote. To convert somebody, go and take them by the hand and guide them, which is a nice sentiment, but is not something that Thomas actually says. He does say something about guardian angels. Guardian angels, according to Thomas Aquinas, do in fact take human beings by the hand as they guard them so that they can guide them to eternal life, encourage them to good works, and protect them against assaults of the demons. Notice what's not being said there, anything about conversion, and it's not about what we ought to do, but rather about what it is that guardian angels do for us miserable human beings. And then we come to this sentiment, which again is not a terrible one, but again is not a true passage from Aquinas. We must love them both, those whose opinions we share and those whose opinions we reject. For both have labored in the search for truth, and both have helped us in finding it. Now, that actually sounds something that, if we get rid of the love language, could be coming from John Stuart Mill's On Liberty rather than from any medieval thinker. And interestingly, it gets attributed to a commentary on Aristotle. Now, which one? Thomas wrote a whole bunch of commentaries on Aristotle. So if we're going to cite Thomas, we should never just say, yes, a commentary on Aristotle, any more than we should say a commentary by Thomas Aquinas on the Bible, since he wrote all sorts of biblical commentaries as well. It's kind of sloppy. And it has been tracked down, something like it, to the Sententia Super Metaphysicam, so a commentary on the metaphysics. And Thomas Aquinas is quoting Aristotle, who says something like this: if anyone in treating this subject should be found to form a different opinion from the one stated here, we must respect both views, but accept the more certain or more accurate. Now notice there's nothing about loving people there, and there's nothing about, everybody searching for truth and that they help you out or anything like that. It's more that we need to respect both views, and it doesn't say about respecting persons as such, just the views in question. Here we come to number 10. If the highest aim of a captain were to preserve his ship, he would keep it in port forever. Now, this is a paraphrase of something that Thomas does in fact say in the Summa Theologia Prima Secundae question to the treatise on happiness. A captain does not intend as a last end the preservation of the ship entrusted to him, since a ship is ordained to something else as its end, that is to navigation, going from one place to another. Now, would keeping the ship in port be a way to preserve it? I guess it could be, provided that no ship runs into it, there aren't any worms that eat the wood. I mean, there's a lot of assumptions that have to be built into this in order to get that quote from the actual thing that Thomas Aquinas has indeed said. But notice that Thomas doesn't say anything about keeping it in port, right? And so where is this going to be found? It's in this person, L.L. Fuller's Morality of Law, where he says, as Thomas Aquinas remarked long ago, if the highest aim of a captain were to preserve his ship, he would keep it in port forever. So Fuller is the one who's coming up with this formulation, loosely paraphrasing Thomas Aquinas, but he's not quite getting it right. He's adding something extra in there. And so that's the real provenance of that. Finally, we get to this really interesting bonus quote. And this one is still floating around all over the place. How is it that they live in such harmony, the billions of stars, when most men can barely go a minute without declaring war in their minds? And this is actually a fairly recent thing. It's coming from a longer poem where it continues, there are wars where no one marches with a flag, though that does not keep casualties from mounting. Our hearts irrigate the earth. We are fields before each other. How can we live in harmony? First, we need to know we are all madly in love with the same God. Now, is that remotely something that Thomas Aquinas would say, even in his poetic moments? Thomas did write some poetry. That's quite true. Thomas didn't write this poem. This is by a guy named Daniel Ladinsky, who authored a book called Love Poems from God, where he claims to take, 6 Western and 6 Eastern. That already should make us a little suspect, hearing that Western Eastern language people and present their poems. But of course, he is doing sort of a loose paraphrase and adding to them. So it's not really any of these authors. And he's actually been taken to task by quite a few people about his appropriation of Islamic authors. I think that anybody who's interested in Thomas Aquinas could say, yeah, that guy is basically making it up as he goes along, and he attributed it to somebody that probably he thought could sell some books. I don't know. Maybe that's being a little bit too cynical, but I don't have an awful lot of respect for people who take famous authors and then add in all their own stuff and say, oh, I'm just getting to the real meaning of it. I'm a little bit leery of those. So anyway, that is the bonus. This is attributable to Ladinsky, not to Thomas Aquinas. So as always, I want to close by just mentioning a few things that you probably want to do if you want to be a thoughtful person. You should always exercise healthy suspicion when you see people circulating quotes without saying where the quote is actually from. Simply saying Thomas Aquinas is not good enough. You got to say what text it's from. Otherwise, it's good chance that it's fake. So don't repost fake quotes. If you know that they're fake, you're actually screwing things up for the rest of us. If you don't know whether it's true or fake, see if you can track it down. Demand the sources from people. And I would say in this case, so I've often brought up Quote Investigator. That's a great site for these sorts of things. But when it comes to Thomas Aquinas and certain other authors, folks' citations, because sometimes the internet is wrong, great helpful site. That person has done a lot of good work that helped me to produce this video. And there's all sorts of other figures that are talked about in that website. So both of those are some pretty good places to go to find out whether something is real or whether it's fake. Both of them are great at tracking these things down and giving you the true backstory of where these quotations, and I'm putting quotations in quotation marks there, actually came from. So we'll do more of these down the line, but that is it for Thomas Aquinas.